Blood smells like rusted pipes and bad pennies. It's a scent that doesn't belong in a diner that reeks of burnt coffee and industrial bleach. But when a man in a $3,000 suit collapses into booth 4, gasping for air, the metallic tang of copper suddenly overrides everything else. The graveyard shift at the Starlight Diner was an exercise in sensory deprivation, punctuated only by the hum of a dying neon sign. Sadie leaned against the laminate counter, staring at the rain streaking down the front window. The uniform she wore, a stiff polyester nightmare in pale yellow, dug relentlessly into the soft flesh of her waist. She shifted her weight, feeling the familiar dull ache in the arches of her feet. Her orthopedic shoes squeaked against the sticky linoleum. It was 3:14 a.m. The city outside was a blurred smear of sodium vapor streetlights and wet asphalt. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of old frying oil, damp mop water, and the sharp bite of ammonia. When the front door shoved open, the brass bell above it gave a choked tinny rattle. Sadie didn't look up immediately. She grabbed a damp rag, wiping a crumb-dusted section of the counter that had been clean for an hour. Only when she heard the heavy, dragging footsteps did she raise her eyes. He didn't walk so much as pilot a failing vessel. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone. He wore a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than Sadie made in 2 years of double shifts. But the suit was ruined. The fabric clung to him, heavy with rainwater and something darker, thicker, pooling near his ribs. He staggered past the counter, his breathing a wet, ragged wheeze that cut through the quiet hum of the refrigerators. He didn't look at her. He made a blind, stumbling path toward the back of the diner, collapsing into booth 4. The cracked crimson vinyl shrieked in protest under his weight. He slumped against the window, his head rolling back against the glass with a hollow thud. Sadie froze. Her fingers tightened around the damp rag until the dirty water squeezed out, dripping onto her sensible shoes. The rational part of her brain screamed to pick up the rotary phone behind the register and dial 911. People who bled into expensive suits at 3 a.m. brought violence with them. She was 26, tired, and deeply aware of her own fragility. She had spent her entire life trying to take up as little space as possible, hiding her soft, heavy body under oversized cardigans and averted gazes. But as she watched the man from across the empty dining room, she saw his hands. They were large, scarred, and trembling violently. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the formica table, trying to anchor himself to consciousness. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat, tossed the rag onto the counter, and walked over. "Sir?" Sadie kept her distance, pausing at the edge of the booth. "Do you need me to call an ambulance?" Up close, the reality of him was terrifying. His skin wasn't just pale, it was an ashen, translucent grey. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, matting dark hair against his temples. A thin line of blackish blood cracked the corner of his lips. When he slowly turned his head to look at her, Sadie felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her stomach. His eyes were a pale, fractured ice blue, and the pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. There was no warmth in them. Even half dead, he looked at her with a sharp, calculating assessment of a predator, calculating a threat. "Oh, no," he rasped. The word was barely a breath, rough like sandpaper on drywall. "No, cops. No medics." "You're bleeding out in my booth," Sadie pointed out, her voice shaking despite her attempt to keep it level. The smell of him was overwhelming now, wet wool, expensive sandalwood cologne, and the hot, raw stench of failing biology. "Not bleeding," he choked out, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He dragged his trembling hand up to his chest, clutching his own throat. Poison, aconite, maybe heavy metals, burning. He convulsed suddenly, his spine arching off the vinyl seat. A harsh, rattling cough tore from his chest, and he spat a glob of dark, bile-stained saliva onto the floor. Sadie stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. She wasn't a nurse. She dropped out of community college 2 years ago because she couldn't pass biology. She poured coffee. She scraped burnt eggs off the flat-top grill. "Please," the man whispered. The command had left his voice, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a dying animal. He reached out, his long fingers blindly catching the fabric of her apron. The grip was shockingly weak. "Hide me!" Before she could answer, headlights swept across the rain-lashed windows. Sadie snapped her head toward the street. 3 black SUVs had just aggressively jumped the curb across the street, their engines idling high, headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. The doors were already opening. Men in dark jackets were stepping out into the rain. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Sadie's veins. They weren't cops. Cops parked. These men swarmed. She looked back down at the man in the booth. His eyes were rolling back, the whites showing. His grip on her apron slackening. He was a bad man. Good men didn't get poisoned and hunted by kill squads in the dead of night. She should walk away. She should hide in the bathroom and let the monsters sort themselves out. But he was dying, and she was the only thing standing between him and the end of his life. "Damn it!" Sadie hissed. "Get up," she ordered, dropping the polite deference of a waitress. She grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit and hauled him forward. He groaned, a wet, sickening sound, but his legs were dead weight. Sadie felt the sheer mass of him pull against her arms. She was a big girl. All her life, people had made her feel heavy, cumbersome, slow. But right now, her low centre of gravity and the sturdy thickness of her legs were the only things anchoring them both to the floor. She wedged her shoulder under his armpit, wrapping her thick arm around his waist. "Push with your feet, come on!" He tried. He managed a dragging, shuffling step. Sadie drove her boots into the floor, gritting her teeth as the strain burned through her thighs and lower back. They lurched out of the booth. The diner suddenly felt the size of a football field. The glow of the headlights from outside threw long, distorted shadows across the checkered tiles. She dragged him past the counter, pushing through the swinging metal door that led to the kitchen. The air here was warmer, heavy with the smell of stale grease and the pilot lights of the industrial stoves. "Where?" he slurred, his head lolling against her shoulder. His cheek was burning hot, radiating a feverish heat through her thin uniform shirt. "Storage room, shut up," she breathed, her lungs burning. At the very back of the kitchen, past the walk-in freezer, was the dry storage pantry. It was little more than a reinforced closet. Sadie kicked the heavy wooden door open, hauled him inside, and let him slide down the wall. He hit the concrete floor hard, landing in a heap between a 50-pound sack of flour and a stack of industrial tomato sauce cans. The pantry smelled overwhelmingly of raw yellow onions, dusty cardboard, and damp earth. There were no windows. It was practically a tomb. "Stay quiet," she whispered, leaning down. She grabbed a handful of paper towels from a nearby shelf and pressed them against his mouth as he began to cough again. "Do not make a sound." The brass bell above the front door chimed. Sadie's heart slammed against her ribs. The sound echoed through the empty diner, followed immediately by the heavy, deliberate thud of wet boots on linoleum. She turned off the single bulb in the pantry, plunging Victor into darkness, and pulled the heavy door shut. She heard the latch click. It wasn't locked. It couldn't lock from the outside, but it looked flush with the wall. Taking a deep breath, Sadie wiped her trembling hands on her apron. She walked over to the dish pit, grabbed a stack of dirty ceramic mugs, and pushed back through the swinging doors into the front of the diner. 3 men stood in the aisle. They were large, their clothes soaking wet, water dripping onto the clean floor she had just mopped. The man in the centre had a brutal flat face with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His eyes swept the diner, taking in the empty stools, the humming pie case, and finally, Sadie. She clutched the stack of mugs to her chest, making herself look as small, as startled, and as pathetic as possible. It wasn't hard. Her hands were shaking violently. Can I help you, gentlemen?" Her voice pitched high, trembling. "We're technically closed for cleaning, but I can get you coffee to go." The man with the scar stepped forward. He smelled of cheap metallic cologne, wet leather, and a faint, acrid undertone that Sadie distantly recognized from her uncle's hunting trips. "Gunpowder. We're looking for someone," the man said. His voice was flat, devoid of any conversational warmth. "A guy, tall, dark suit. Came in here about 3 minutes ago." Nobody came in, Sadie lied. She widened her eyes, letting genuine fear flood her face. I've been in the back washing dishes for the last 20 minutes. The bell just startled me. I thought you were the delivery guy. The man stared at her. He looked at her stained apron, her flushed round face, the messy bun slipping down the back of her neck. He was looking right through her. To men like this, women like Sadie were invisible. They were part of the furniture. Background noise. Check the back, the man ordered the two thugs behind him. Hey, you can't go back there. Sadie stepped forward, her voice cracking. My manager will fire me. The man pulled back the lapel of his jacket. The dull black grip of a handgun sat snug in a shoulder holster. He didn't touch it. He just let her see it. Stand still, sweetheart, he said softly. Sadie froze, biting her lip so hard she tasted blood. She listened to the heavy boots kick open the swinging kitchen doors. She tracked their movements by sound. The crash of a garbage can being shoved aside. The heavy squeak of the walk-in freezer door opening and slamming shut. Don't open the pantry, she prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Please, don't open the pantry. The seconds stretched into an agonizing eternity. The only sound in the front room was the hum of the refrigerator and the rain lashing the glass. The man with the scar never took his eyes off her, watching her sweat, watching her swallow her terror. Finally, the kitchen doors swung open. Nothing, one of the thugs grunted. Place is a dump, just rats and rotting lettuce. The leader frowned, his jaw tightening. He looked toward the front window, staring at the street. He wouldn't have made it far, not with what's in his veins. Back to the cars. We grid the alleys. Without another word, they turned and walked out. The brass bell chimed its sad little song. Sadie didn't move. She waited until the SUVs backed out, their tires squealing against the wet pavement, the red tail lights bleeding into the rain until they disappeared down the block. Only then did she drop the mugs. They shattered against the linoleum in a jagged burst of white ceramic. She didn't care. She spun on her heel and sprinted for the kitchen. When Sadie yanked the pantry door open, the smell hit her first. It was the sharp, metallic stench of fresh vomit mixed with the sweet, sickening odour of chemical decay. She fumbled for the pull string, turning on the bare overhead bulb. The man was curled on his side, violently convulsing. His suit jacket was pushed up, revealing a silk shirt plastered to his chest with sweat. He had thrown up bile onto the concrete, a dark, frothy liquid that looked unnatural. His eyes were rolled back, only the whites showing, and his lips had taken on a terrifying cyanotic blue hue. Hey! Hey! Look at me! Sadie dropped to her knees, heedless of the mess on the floor. She grabbed his shoulders, trying to steady him. His skin was freezing cold, yet slick with fever sweat. He gasped, a shallow rattling sound. His eyes fluttered, the pupils still blown wide. He recognized her, but just barely. Alkaloid, he slurred, the word bubbling through the saliva in his mouth. They slipped it. Drink. Burns. Hearts. Stopping. What do I do? Tell me what to do, Sadie pleaded, her hands hovering over his chest, terrified to press too hard. Carbon? He choked out. He reached up, his fingers clawing weakly at her forearm, his nails digging into her skin. Charcoal. Bind. Bind the poison. Pump. Stomach. His eyes rolled back again, and his jaw locked tight. Charcoal, Sadie repeated, panic making her vision narrow. Charcoal. She didn't have medical-grade activated charcoal. This was a diner, not a pharmacy. But she had a kitchen, and she knew what charcoal was made of. She scrambled to her feet, leaving him convulsing on the floor, and ran to the prep station. She grabbed half a loaf of cheap white sandwich bread, tearing the plastic open with her teeth. She threw the slices onto the flat-top grill, cranking the gas to maximum heat. The flames roared beneath the thick steel plate. While the bread scorched, she grabbed a plastic pitcher, filling it with lukewarm tap water. She found the industrial salt container and dumped a heavy handful into the water, stirring it frantically with a wooden spoon. Salt water to induce vomiting. It was an old trick her mother used when Sadie's childhood dog ate something toxic. She prayed human biology wasn't drastically different. Thick black smoke began to billow from the grill. The smell of burning starch filled the kitchen, setting off a quiet, rhythmic clicking in the exhaust vent. Sadie grabbed a metal spatula and scraped the completely blackened, ashen husks of bread off the grill. They were rigid, pure carbon. She threw them into a metal mixing bowl and pulverized them with the heavy end of a meat tenderizer, until they were nothing but gritty black powder. She dumped the ash into the saltwater pitcher, creating a thick, horrifying sludge that looked like liquid asphalt. She ran back to the pantry, dropping to her knees beside him. He was still. Too still. The convulsions had stopped, replaced by a shallow, erratic flutter in his chest. No, you don't get to die here and leave me with a body, Sadie growled, her voice cracking with raw desperation. She hauled him up by his collar, dragging his heavy torso into her lap. His head lolled back against her stomach. She didn't care about the blood soaking into her uniform, or the sweat, or the vomit. She pried his jaw open with her thumb, forcing his teeth apart. "Drink this," she ordered. He gagged, instinctively fighting her. His hand came up, weakly trying to shove the pitcher away. "Drink it!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the cramped pantry. She tipped the pitcher, forcing the thick black sludge into his mouth. He choked, coughing violently, black liquid spilling down his chin and staining his expensive shirt. But Sadie didn't stop. She pinched his nose shut, forcing him to swallow to breathe. It was brutal, ugly, and entirely undignified. She was practically drowning him in ash and salt. He swallowed convulsively, his throat working in ragged gulps. She forced nearly half the pitcher down his throat before he ripped his head away, gagging violently. "Get it up," she coached, quickly shifting her legs to push him onto his side. "Throw it up, come on." It took less than 30 seconds for the heavy concentration of salt to hit his stomach. His entire body went rigid. He doubled over, and his stomach forcefully evacuated. Sadie held his shoulders, keeping him from collapsing face first into the concrete as his body violently purged the poison. The sound was wretched, echoing off the cinder block walls. He retched until there was nothing left but dry, agonizing heaves, his body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. When it was finally over, he collapsed sideways. He was trembling violently, his breathing still ragged, but the cyanotic blue hue around his lips was beginning to fade. The immediate violent crisis had broken. Sadie slumped back against the bags of flour, her chest heaving. Her arms ached, her uniform was ruined, and she smelled like bile and burnt toast. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in black ash and shaking so badly she couldn't make a fist. The man slowly rolled his head to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites cracked with red veins, but the feral panic was gone. Now there was just profound, exhausting clarity. He looked at the ruined state of his suit, the black sludge on his hands, and then up at the fat, exhausted waitress sitting in the dirt with him. He didn't speak. He didn't offer a dramatic thank you. He just stared at her, the silence between them heavy with the bizarre, intimate trauma of what had just happened. Sadie wiped her forehead with the back of her dirty wrist, smearing ash across her brow. "If you throw up on my shoes again," she said, her voice a flat, deadpan rasp, "I'm calling the men in the SUVs." The adrenaline left Sadie's system not in a slow fade, but in a brutal, jarring drop. Her knees buckled. She slid down the cinder block wall, her back scraping against the rough paint until her hips hit the cold concrete. For a long time, the only sound in the dry storage room was the ragged, syncopated rhythm of their breathing. Victor, she had decided that was his name in the frantic moments she had spent dragging him, was slumped against the 50-pound sacks of flour. He looked like a corpse that had been hastily arranged by an amateur mortician. His charcoal suit was irreparably ruined, plastered to his body with sweat, rainwater, and a grim mosaic of black charcoal sludge. He hadn't moved since the violent purging stopped, his chin resting against his chest. Sadie closed her eyes, pressing the heels of her hands into her eye sockets until bursts of static colour flared in the darkness. Her arms felt like lead. The arches of her feet throbbed with a dull, persistent agony. "What time is it?" The voice was a cracked, ruinous rasp. Sadie opened her eyes. Victor was watching her. His ice-blue eyes were no longer clouded with fever and dilated panic. They were sharp, focused, and uncomfortably still. The feral desperation was gone, replaced by a calculating intelligence that made the cramped pantry feel significantly smaller. Sadie didn't reach for her pocket. 4:30, maybe 4:45. Victor grimaced, a subtle tightening of his jaw, and shifted his weight. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth as his ribs protested. He looked down at his hands, turning them over, inspecting the black ash caked under his fingernails and smeared across his palms. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together, feeling the grit. Salt, he noted, his voice flat. And ash. Burnt bread, Sadie corrected. She didn't have the energy to infuse her voice with anything resembling customer service. She was a 26-year-old dropout sitting in a puddle of water and charcoal. I carbonized half a loaf of white sandwich bread on the flat top and mixed it with a half cup of iodized salt to induce vomiting and bind the alkaloids. Victor stopped rubbing the ash between his fingers. He looked up, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden heavy weight. He didn't blink. He just stared at her, assessing the round, flushed face, the messy hair escaping a cheap plastic claw clip, the stained yellow polyester uniform that clung uncomfortably to her heavy frame. Most people looked at Sadie and saw a background character, someone who refilled their coffee and disappeared. Victor looked at her like she was an anomaly in a data set. "You're a waitress," he said. It wasn't a question. Astute observation. I usually wear the grease-stained apron for the glamour. She pushed herself up from the floor, her joints popping in the quiet room. "Don't move. I have to clean this up before the morning prep cook gets here at 5:30. If Carl sees this, he'll call the health inspector and I'll lose my job." Victor let out a sound that might have been a laugh if his throat hadn't been ravaged by acid. "You just saved a man from an aconite poisoning, and you're worried about the prep cook." "I'm worried about making rent," Sadie snapped, stepping over his outstretched legs. "I don't know who you are. I don't know who those men in the SUVs were, and frankly, I don't want to. I want you to sit there, not die, and let me bleach this floor." She left the pantry, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind her. The kitchen felt unnervingly normal. The pilot lights hissed. The refrigerator compressors hummed their low, steady drone. Sadie walked over to the janitorial closet, grabbed the heavy yellow mop bucket and wheeled it to the utility sink. She poured a reckless, eye-watering amount of industrial bleach into the basin, letting the hot water run until the chemical vapor burned her nostrils and made her eyes tear up. She needed the pain. She needed the sharp, biting scent of chlorine to scrub the metallic tang of blood and bile from her nasal passages. When she wheeled the bucket back into the pantry, Victor had managed to sit up straighter. He had stripped off the ruined suit jacket, tossing it onto a crate of canned tomatoes. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, clinging to the heavy, corded muscles of his chest. Without the jacket, the sheer physical mass of him was intimidating. He wasn't just tall, he was built like a cinder-block wall. Sadie ignored him. She dropped the heavy mop head onto the concrete and began to work. She scrubbed with a mechanical, punishing rhythm. She drove the thick cotton strands into the porous concrete, letting the bleach eat away the evidence of the night's violence. She didn't look at him, but she could feel his eyes tracking her every movement. "Why didn't you give me up?" The question cut through the sloshing sound of the mop water. Sadie paused, leaning her weight against the wooden handle. She looked at the murky water pooling around her squeaking orthopedic shoes. "I thought about it. They had guns. I was dying. The logical play was to hand me over." Victor's voice was analytical, devoid of gratitude. He was trying to solve a puzzle. In his world, people acted out of fear or greed. Sadie's actions didn't fit either metric. "The logical play," Sadie repeated, her tone dripping with exhaustion. She resumed mopping, driving the handle forward with a sharp thrust. The logical play would be leaving this town 5 years ago. The logical play wouldn't be working the graveyard shift for tips that barely cover my bus fare. I don't make logical plays. You risked your life for a stranger. You were choking on your own blood in my booth, Sadie shot back, finally looking at him. Her chest heaved, a sudden, inexplicable anger flaring in her gut. "What did you want me to do? Watch you die while I wipe down the counter? I'm not a monster. Victor held her gaze. The overhead bulb cast harsh, downward shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the hollows of his cheeks. Most people are. The absolute certainty in his voice sent a cold shiver down Sadie's spine. He wasn't being dramatic. He was stating a fact, born from a life she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Well, I'm not," Sadie said, her voice dropping to a quiet, stubborn murmur. She wrung out the mop, the dirty water splashing into the yellow bucket. "But I need you out of here. Carl will be here in 20 minutes. The sun is coming up." Victor nodded slowly. The simple movement seemed to cost him. He placed a hand against the wall, his knuckles white, and forced himself up. His legs shook, the muscles trembling under his slacks, but he locked his knees, standing to his full, imposing height. He swayed slightly, his hand flying to his ribs. Sadie instinctively stepped forward, her hand reaching out to catch him, but she stopped herself, her fingers hovering in the air between them. Victor looked at her outstretched hand, then up at her face. A strange, unreadable expression flickered across his features. It was the first time she'd seen anything resembling vulnerability in him. "I need a phone," he said quietly. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed in a pale, bruised grey light. Sadie led Victor out the back door of the kitchen, stepping into the narrow alleyway behind the diner. The air smelled of wet asphalt, rotting cardboard from the dumpsters, and the faint, salty breeze coming off the distant harbour. Victor leaned heavily against the brick wall of the diner, his breathing shallow in the cool morning air. He looked terrible, pale, bruised, his expensive shirt ruined, but the terrifying proximity to death had passed. He was solidifying again, his posture hardening, the predator returning to its natural state. Sadie dug into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out her phone. It was an older model, the screen webbed with a network of cracks. She unlocked it and handed it to him. "Don't drop it," she muttered. "It's the only one I have." Victor took the phone, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was incredibly cold, rough with calluses. He didn't dial immediately. He looked at the cracked screen, then at Sadie. "Go inside," he ordered, his voice taking on an authoritative clip that hadn't been there before. "Lock the back door. Don't come out until your shift is over." "I have to take the trash out anyway," Sadie argued, stubbornly crossing her thick arms over her chest. The cold air was biting through her thin uniform, but she refused to let him dismiss her like a subordinate. Victor's eyes narrowed. "The men looking for me are professionals. If they realize I survived, they will retrace their steps. You being seen with me makes you a loose end. If they come back, I'll tell them you held me at gunpoint and stole my phone," Sadie lied smoothly. "I've been lying to angry cooks and demanding managers since I was 18. I can handle a few men in cheap suits." They weren't wearing cheap suits. They smelled like cheap cologne. A huff of air escaped Victor's nose. It was definitively a laugh this time, dark and brief. He punched a sequence of numbers into her cracked screen with his thumb, holding the phone to his ear. Sadie turned away, pretending to inspect the padlock on the dumpster, but she listened. He didn't say hello. "It's me," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and metallic. The harbour deal was a setup. Aconite in the scotch. It was an inside job. He paused, listening. "I don't care. Find out who poured the drinks, break their hands, and keep them breathing until I get back. Send a car. The alley behind the diner on 4th and Elm." He ended the call and held the phone out to her. Sadie took it, slipping it back into her apron. The silence in the alley stretched, heavy with the impending finality of his departure. The distant rumble of early morning traffic began to bleed into the quiet. Inside the diner, Sadie could hear the heavy thud of the kitchen door. Carl had arrived, and "My shift starts in 5 minutes," Sadie said, breaking the silence. She didn't know why she was lingering. She should be inside, tying on a clean apron, brewing the first pots of decaf, but her feet felt glued to the wet asphalt. Victor pushed himself off the brick wall. He reached into his pocket, the only clean pocket left on his slacks, and pulled out a thick silver money clip. It was heavy, packed tight with crisp $100 bills. He peeled off a stack, roughly an inch thick, and held it out to her. Sadie looked at the money, then up at his face. Her stomach tightened, a hot flush of embarrassment and anger rising in her cheeks. "I don't want your money." Victor frowned, confusion flashing in his pale eyes. "Take it. It's for the ruined bread. And the uniform." "I said no." Sadie stepped back, shaking her head. I didn't shove charcoal down your throat for a tip. I did it because you were dying. You don't get to pay me off and pretend it was just a transaction. For a moment, Victor looked genuinely thrown. He was a man who navigated the world through leverage, fear, and capital. Everything had a price. Everyone had a number. Sadie's refusal broke the fundamental rules of his reality. He looked at the money in his hand, then slowly slid it back into his pocket. You're an idiot, he said quietly, but there was no malice in it. I'm aware, Sadie replied, a bitter smile touching the corner of her lips. Headlights swept into the mouth of the alley. 2 sleek black sedans glided over the wet pavement, coming to a silent stop a few yards away. The doors opened, and 4 men stepped out. They were dressed similarly to the men from the night before, but their posture was entirely different. They looked frantic, their eyes scanning the alley before locking onto Victor. Boss, the closest man said, relief flooding his voice as he rushed forward. Victor held up a hand, stopping the man in his tracks. He didn't look at his crew. He kept his eyes on Sadie. The gap between them was suddenly vast. The cars, the men, the silent, violent authority radiating from Victor. It all snapped into focus, a stark reminder of the chasm separating their worlds. He was a king of the underworld, battered but unbroken. She was a waitress with aching feet and a stained shirt. He took a step toward her. The men behind him stiffened, but Victor ignored them. He reached out, his large calloused hand catching her wrist. Sadie flinched, but his grip was gentle. He turned her hand over, exposing the pale skin of her inner arm. Right above her wrist, angry and red, was a fresh burn mark. A crescent-shaped blister she'd gotten from scraping the burning bread off the flat-top grill. He traced the edge of the burn lightly with his thumb. The touch sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, completely at odds with the freezing temperature of his skin. A debt incurred, Victor murmured, his voice low, meant only for her. Is a debt repaid? He didn't wait for her to respond. He let go of her hand, turned, and walked toward the waiting cars. His men fell in seamlessly around him, a protective barrier of dark wool and silent violence. The back door of the lead sedan was opened for him. Before he ducked inside, Victor paused. He looked back over his shoulder. Through the grey morning mist, his pale eyes locked onto hers one last time, pinning her to the asphalt. Then he got in. The doors slammed shut with a heavy, synchronized thud. The sedans reversed out of the alley, their tires hissing over the wet pavement, and disappeared into the morning traffic. Sadie stood in the empty alley for a long time. The cold was finally starting to seep into her bones. She rubbed her wrist, her thumb lingering over the spot where he had touched the burn. The heavy metal door behind her banged open. Sadie, Carl's gravelly voice barked into the alley. Coffee maker's empty. We got 2 truckers out front waiting for their scrambled eggs. Let's go. Sadie closed her eyes, taking one last deep breath of the damp, salty air. The metallic tang of blood was gone, replaced entirely by the smell of exhaust and rotting cardboard. Coming, Carl, she called back. She turned and walked back into the diner. The neon sign above the window hummed, flickering slightly as it fought against the rising sun. Sadie tied a fresh, stiff apron around her waist, grabbed a ceramic mug, and poured a cup of cheap black coffee. Her shift had just begun. But as she walked out to the floor, her boots squeaking against the freshly bleached linoleum, she knew the quiet, invisible life she had spent years building was already over. The monster had seen her, and monsters never forgot. If the gritty, slow-burn tension of Sadie and Victor's collision hooked you, don't let their story end here. Hit that like button to show your support and share this video with fellow romance and drama lovers who crave grounded, high-stakes storytelling. Want to see what happens when the Mafia boss comes back to collect his debt? Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss the next thrilling chapter.